participant? Yeah, there. Hi, nice to meet you. Very, very nice. So I might start now. So I have the extreme honor to introduce Professor Karl Friston, who is Professor for Neurology at University College London, and he is Scientific Director of the Wellcome Test Center for Neuroimaging in London. He is one of the leading experts for brain imaging, and in particular, he invented the key technology SPM, which is cited as a single paper more often than the publications or the citations of others in their whole lifetime. So he is regarded as one of the top 10 most influential neuroscientists. And I think personally that this research is a superb example of how formal mathematical modeling and machine learning can help to understand key questions of mankind, so how the brain works. Professor Friston is a recipient of the first Young Investigators Award in Human Brain Mapping, Fellow of Royal Society, Fellow of Academy of Medical Sciences, recipient of Minerva Golden Brain Award, and actually the awards are so many that I would eat up your time. Therefore, rather than elaborating on your CV, please allow me to give the word to you and to learn more about active inference. I'm pleased to attend your talk and everyone else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I very much welcome the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to talk about active inference and ask a question: what is optimal about behavior? And in particular, are there different kinds of optimality, specifically Bayesian optimality, in terms of those things that we aspire to, and the information gain consequent upon our sentient behavior? My talk's going to have two parts to it. I'm going to, first of all, set up the framework in terms of self-evidencing, namely action and perception in the service of maximizing the evidence for our generative models of the world. I'm going to motivate that in terms of normative accounts of sentient behavior, and relate it specifically to things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. The second part of the talk will use simulations to illustrate technically the kind of message passing entailed by the first principle account of the first half of the talk. And I want to conclude but with a special focus on epistemic foraging, responding to affordances that denote information gain following a particular course of action or policy. So, self-evidencing active inference is predicated on the notion that there's one underlying objective function such that we can read perception and action as a process of optimization. So what are we optimizing? Effectively, we're optimizing the log probability of some outcomes given a generative model, or more simply me, who would anticipate those outcomes. And clearly that's almost a tautological specification of the kinds of outcomes I expect to encounter. So we can read this as those outcomes that have value, and we can, from that reading, motivate a description in terms of reinforcement learning, in engineering optimal control theory, and if we were an economist, this would be something like expected utility theory. What I will go on to unpack is an approximation, a bound approximation to this kind of value that I'm going to refer to as a variational free energy, or more simply free energy. Interestingly, the negative of this free energy or value is self-information, or surprisal, or more simply surprise in information theory. So this provides a normative account of sentient behavior in terms of things like the principle of maximum efficiency, or the principle of minimum redundancy, the Infermax principle, and indeed the free energy principle itself. That in turn is interesting because the long-term average of surprisal or surprise or self-information is entropy. So if we imagine that action and perception are always trying to maximize value or minimize surprise, then on average, it will look as if action and perception are also trying to minimize entropy. And that, of course, is a holy grail of many accounts of behavior in terms of self-organization, particularly synergetics. And of course, if I were a physiologist, this would just be a statement of homeostasis, keeping physiological states within viable bounds, resisting the second law, where those physiological states would be dispersed and I would dissipate, dissolve, and possibly die. There's a final perspective on this quantity, which I'm going to leverage, and that's a much more statistical perspective, namely the probability of outcomes given me as a model. And in Bayesian statistics, that will be known as Bayesian model evidence, and from that we can link to accounts of brain function in terms of the Bayesian brain hypothesis, evidence accumulation, perceptions hypothesis testing, predictive coding, and so on. So those are, if you like, some of the normative theories that can all be subsumed by putting in play a particular objective function. And the form of the objective function that I'm going to consider is a free energy that comprises a negative energy and an entropy here. For those of you not familiar with this, you can see this as essentially a statement of James's maximum entropy principle, so that we want to effectively maximize the entropy of our beliefs about the states of the world that are generating outcomes under certain constraints. And those constraints, we will see, are described by the likelihood of those outcomes given those states, those usually hidden or latent states of the world, and our prior beliefs about the states of affairs generating our observable outcomes. So in machine learning, many people will be familiar with this as an evidence lower bound. So I can unpack this free energy function, or its functional form, in terms of an expected log evidence, simply the probability of some outcomes under a given model, plus a Kullback-Leibler divergence that can never be less than 0, and that constitutes a bound on the log evidence, giving me this notion of an elbow or an evidence lower bound. That's, I think, an important perspective. Because I'm defining the evidence in relation to a generative model, I have now, at the start, an explainable and interpretable account of how any data that I'm trying to classify or use to infer the causes generates those data. So basically, I should have, for free, explainable and interpretable artificial intelligence. What we will see is that we'll also, for free, from this Bayesian perspective, leverage a design optimality in terms of optimal experimental design, which we can understand as augmenting an abductive inference, and indeed, if we take that abduction through from inference to learning, autopoietic, self-constructing, self-teaching kind of inference and learning, which in principle would lead to a first principle account of data foraging and epistemics, and possibly generalized AI or AGI. I want to look at this objective function from a different perspective, simply by rearranging the terms. So all I've done here is just move the terms around and expressed it in a way that would be more familiar to statisticians. So this same objective function can be written down as a mixture of accuracy and complexity, where the accuracy is simply the expected log likelihood of some observable data given their causes, minus the complexity, that is simply the KL divergence between my posterior beliefs Q and some prior beliefs about the states generating those data. So that's an intuitive view of this objective functional. The complexity term plays a key role here. Many people will recognize this in terms of Occam's principle. In the brain, this translates into things like functional specialization and redundancy minimization, efficient coding. From an engineering perspective, this complexity also can be understood in terms of minimizing the computational cost. Literally, the degree to which I have to change my mind in going from my prior beliefs to my posterior beliefs in order to provide an accurate account of the data at hand. Implicit in those priors, of course, are parsimonious explanations and beliefs, possibly heuristics, about the generation of the data that I'm trying to explain. From the point of view of thermodynamics, that computational complexity translates directly into a thermodynamic, or in biology, a metabolic cost via things like the Jarzynski equality and Landauer's principle, which, put very simply, means that if I'm doing it in the right kind of way, I'm doing it very quickly, and I'm doing it with the minimum use of energy. What I really want to do, though, is to take that sort of partition of the right kinds of inference and actions in the moment and think about the free energy in the future following a particular act upon the world. What we're going to see when we consider self-evidencing in the future is the emergence of, again, this dual perspective on an objective function in terms of optimal Bayesian design that we will see effectively maximizes the accuracy I expect following a move or a sampling of some data, while the expected complexity corresponds to optimal Bayesian decision-making in relation to some prior preferences. And the two together constitute this self-evidencing, so that the Bayes optimal design perspective and Bayes optimal decisions are two aspects of the same thing, two sides of the same coin, which is this underlying imperative to maximize this evidence lower bound. So to make that more heuristic, let me just pose a question to the audience. Imagine you're an owl and you're hungry. And if we were in person, I would actually ask someone in the audience to say, what are you going to do next? And almost invariably, somebody correctly replies, well, I'm going to look for my food. I'm going to search for my prey and then predate that prey. That simple answer has a lot of implications for the choice of the account of sentient behavior. If it were the case that I were simply choosing my actions in order to maximize some value function of the states that would ensue, say S of t plus 1, following a particular action, I could formulate optimal behavior in terms of a state action policy. So I would be choosing those behaviors or those control variables that maximized my value function, my state action value function of the consequences of behaving, and thereby elaborate an optimal policy. However, the simple answer, I'm going to search for food, means that this may not be the best way of formulating optimal behavior. So why is that? Well, to search is to resolve uncertainty about where my food is. But uncertainty is an attribute of a belief. Therefore, that tells us that perhaps the better kind of objective function, or certainly its functional form, is a functional in the sense that it's a function of a function where that function is a belief. So put that simply, optimal action may depend upon states of the world or on beliefs about states of the world. So I'm, if you like, formalizing that in terms of actions that maximize a functional G of beliefs about states of the world given a particular behavior. Furthermore, thinking about the searching for food example, it matters the order in which I do things. So I can either try to eat my prey and then search for it, or search for it, identify where it is, and then try to eat it. And that ordered aspect leads us into the notion of sequential policy optimization. And technically, that has implications for the functional form of a normative account based upon an objective functional. And I've formulated that here in terms of maximizing a path integral of a functional of the beliefs about states of the world that would ensue under a particular policy, where a policy here now is read as a sequence of actions or controls, which is distinct from the state action policy here. And the reason that I'm trying to emphasize the difference between these two things is to deliberately introduce a dialectic between accounts of sentient behavior based upon Bellman's optimality principle versus this path integral of an energy functional, which in physics will be known as an action. So what we're talking about basically is a principle of least action that accounts for optimal action in terms of beliefs about states versus an optimality principle that does not. And many of you will recognize the different themes and schemes that arise under these two complementary approaches to optimizing behavior. So for example, under Bellman's optimality principle, we'd have optimal control theory, dynamic processing, deep RL, Bayesian RL, Bayesian decision theory, state action policy durations, and so on. A slightly different perspective emerges under a principle of least action, including active inference, and probably more interestingly, artificial curiosity, and in robotics, this will be known as intrinsic motivation. I'm going to cast that in terms of optimal Bayesian design. That for free becomes part of sequential policy optimization and the treatment of partially observed Markov decision processes. So what is this free energy and its associated functional that underwrites a principle of least action for a physics of sentience, a Bayesian mechanics that explains or best accounts for optimal behavior? Well, here I've just rewritten the free energy functional function, my apologies, in terms of accuracy and complexity. So this is the KR divergence we've already spoken about, and the accuracy, the log likelihood of outcomes given states. And here, just by moving these terms around, we can see immediately how this also translates into an evidence bound, in the sense that this is another non-negative KL divergence, and this is the evidence associated with particular outcomes. The reason I've written this out is to disclose, to show what I think is quite a beautiful mapping between this quantity and the same quantity that would be expected given I have committed to a particular act. Now, the reason that the expected gets into the game and we move from F to G is that before I have acted, I don't have the sensory outcomes available. So now I have to take an expectation of the free energy under my posterior predicted beliefs about what I would observe if I made that move. And what one sees is that the expected complexity translates into something called risk. The expected accuracy becomes something called, or negative expected accuracy becomes ambiguity, while the evidence bound and log evidence can be read as an intrinsic and extrinsic value respectively. So let me just try and relate that to well-established normative accounts of behavior. First of all, let's just focus on the intrinsic value and pretend we had no prior beliefs about the outcomes that characterize me, sometimes referred to as prior preferences. So let's ignore the extrinsic value, the prior preferences, and see what is left. And what is left is effectively an expected divergence between beliefs about states of the world before and after observing their consequences. And this is just the degree to which my uncertainty has been resolved by committing to this particular policy. Another way of expressing that is the information gain or the epistemic affordance due to this policy. In the visual search literature, that's known as Bayesian surprise. Mathematically, it's just the mutual information between the states of the world causes and their consequences, their observable consequences in the future, conditioned upon a particular policy. What I'm going to do now is take away a particular kind of uncertainty and remove it from the table. And the uncertainty I'm talking about is the ambiguity. So if I remove ambiguity and pretend that I can see directly all these hidden states, these latent states generating data, then I can ignore this and we just are left with the risk term. So what's the risk term? Well, that's another KL divergence, and it just scores the difference between beliefs about states in the future, given that I have committed to this policy, and my prior preferences. So it's just the difference between what I anticipate will happen if I do this versus the kinds of outcomes that I would prefer or expect myself to encounter. And in engineering, this is just KL control. In economics, it's risk sensitive because we are no longer dealing with ambiguity. So let me make a final move here and take away the risk part, in the sense that there is no relative uncertainty about the outcomes of my behavior. And what are we left with? Well, we're left with this term here, which is back to this value term in the first review of normative theories, the extrinsic value that reflects my prior preferences about the kinds of observations I expect to solicit, irrespective of how I behave. And from this, we can interpret optimal behavior in terms of an expected value, for example, in economics, expected utility theory. So there's an interesting relationship between this account of optimal behavior and the Bellman optimality account of optimal behavior that arises when I successively remove different kinds of uncertainty from the problem. And in fact, we can now repair that dialectic between the Bellman optimality principle and the principle of least action simply by saying that the latter is a special case of the principle of least action when there's no uncertainty to worry about. The ensuing computational architecture that we now use to simulate and understand sentient behavior in the neurosciences and in our simulations of active inference is shown on this slide. So in brief, we can think of outcomes being gathered by our sensory organs, being taken into the brain, for example, to be assimilated, to build posterior or Bayesian beliefs that maximize this evidence lower bound about hidden states, external states beyond technically what is a Markov blanket separating the external states from internal brain states, to optimize our beliefs to get the best approximation or best guess about the states generating those outcomes. And then we use our beliefs about the external latent states to evaluate, well, what would happen if I did that in terms of the expected free energy? And we've seen that we can unpack that or carve it into risk and ambiguity terms, and then form beliefs about the most likely policies that we are pursuing. And then we can sample an action from those policies, generate a new observation from the world out there, and the cycle, the action perception cycle, can continue. So in short, policy selection can be cast as maximization of an expected free energy, whereas perceptual inference can be thought of as maximizing this evidence lower bound. So all I've said is essentially we have at hand a variational principle of least action that subsumes both the epistemic information part of optimal behavior and that which can be ascribed to the extrinsic or the expected value under some prior preferences. And together, they simply mean that we are choosing those actions, inferring the plans, the policies that maximize expected free energy. And this is very close, of course, to things, notions like planning and control as inference, but in a way that has this dual aspect of both trying to be information seeking at the same time being reward seeking or goal seeking in our epistemic responses. So let me briefly illustrate what implications that formulation, that sort of least action formulation, has for belief updating in the brain and subsequent behavior. I've written this down formally in a way that I thought might be revealing for people in computer science and actually designing message passing schemes. What this slide is meant to show is that if I had a generative model of how hidden states, unobservable, latent states out there generate outcomes, then I can always write it down as a probabilistic graphical model. So, for example, we could assume a discrete state space model, a hidden Markov model, or a Markov decision process partially observed of the following form, where the world is in different states, one of a number of different states, and they move from one state to the next point in time in accord with a probability transition matrix that itself depends upon the particular sequence of actions that I prosecute, the plan, that itself depends upon the expected free energy. And once I know the states of the world, I can then generate through a likelihood mapping here denoted by the A matrix, some observable outcomes. So this would be a generative model for a partially observed Markov decision process that is inherently inactive in the sense that the state transitions depend upon my action, which itself depends upon the expected free energy. And please ignore these equations here. They're just articulating this example, a fairly generic or universal example of discrete state space models of the way that my observable outcomes, my sensory information could be generated. This is nice because if I can write down a probabilistic graphical model, there will always exist a factor graph, and in this instance, a Forney or normal style factor graph that is the cousin or the conjugate of this graphical model here, where the nodes become edges and the edges become nodes. We don't need to worry about that. All that we need to know is that if we can write this down, we can always write this down. What does writing this down mean? Well, it entails a very precise, a concrete and crisp description of the message passing that would be needed in order to infer all the unknowns here, basically states of the world that I don't know, and what I am doing, the policies. I can infer all of these by passing messages around over these edges that now correspond to the unknowns, the random variables, given the parameterized generative model in terms of the priors, the probability transition matrices, and the likelihoods, namely the likelihood mappings between causes and consequences. And I've just written down this message passing here in terms of belief updating of things that we don't know, states of the world under a particular policy, and the policy, which is just a softmax function of the expected free energy here, and the expressions that inherit from the functional forms of the previous slides written down in terms of linear algebra and the matrices and tensors of the generative model here. Those updates, which are just off-the-shelf variational message passing updates on the previous slide, are quite remarkable, not just in terms of their simplicity, but their isomorphism with the kind of message passing we actually see in the brain. So I've just written them out again here, just to highlight how similar they are to things that we already use to simulate neuronal dynamics and message passing on neuronal networks. So for example, here, the belief updates for hidden states of the world under a particular policy at any particular point in time are just a nonlinear function of a linear mixture of outcomes through the likelihood matrix and beliefs or expectations about past states and future states that are mixed together in the right kind of way to give me the best expectation or guess about the state of the world at any particular time. Policy selection is this a standard softmax function, softmax response function of this expected free energy. I've equipped this model with a precision parameter, which we don't need to worry about too much from the point of view of this talk. It's interesting in neurobiology because it seems to behave very much like a reward prediction error of the kind that people who study dopamine responses in the brain like to think about. Learning just becomes effectively optimizing the parameters of the model. The D here are the initial states at the beginning of a plan or a policy, but the same functional form applies to all the parameters, and it looks exactly like Hebbian or associative plasticity evidence accumulation in this simplest example here. And then action selection is just selecting the most likely action from my inferred or favorite plan. This is a slide that just describes a simple setup, a toy example that I'm going to use to illustrate the generic kinds of behavior that ensue when we solve those belief update equations or that variational message passing on the previous slide. So this is as simple an example as we could find that has both a sort of pragmatic and epistemic bits that speak to the intrinsic and the extrinsic value entailed by the expected free energy. The idea here is that there is a little mouse. It can make two moves in this T-maze, and it wants to find a red reward that can either be in the left or the right upper arm of the maze. But in addition, it has the option of going to the lower arm where there's an instructional cue that will tell it where the reward is. So it can't see where the reward is from its starting point in the center. So it's got a choice. It can either take a gamble and 50% of the time be correct and 50% of the time be wrong, but I should say that once it goes into one of the upper arms, it has to stay there. These are absorbing states. So there's a 50-50 chance that it will secure its reward for two moves or not. Or it can choose to go and solicit the information, garner the information from the instructional cue, but it's wasting one move, but it then knows with a fair degree of certainty where to go to get to the baited arm to get its reward. So from the point of view of an expected utility theory or a Bellman optimality principle, these two plans have the same expected utility of 50%. But from the point of view of something that is self-evidencing, that has this epistemic part to the objective function, the belief-based part, then clearly it is going to be better, or the animal will plan and infer that it will be pursuing an epistemic policy responding to the epistemic affordance of the instructional cue. And indeed, when we build this paradigm into a Markov decision process, write down the factor graph, iterate and solve the belief update equations, that's exactly this kind of behavior which we see. So I'm just summarizing that here with the following graphic. The top panel just shows you the side in which the reward was placed. This image representation here is of the plans that the synthetic mouse committed to with a degree of uncertainty at certain times. These are the outcomes. This is, if you like, the reward or negative loss function here. And these reflect learning as there are updates to the initial state at the beginning of the plan, namely the context is the reward on the left or the right. And what we see is at the beginning, as we'd anticipate, the the mouse goes and gets its a response to its epistemic affordance and then goes to secure its reward. And then what we've done is leave, after the first couple of trials, the reward on this side. So as time goes on, it learns that the context is almost is increasingly likely to be reward on the left-hand side. And this has the effect of reducing the epistemic or the intrinsic value, the information gain, the epistemic affordance, relative to the extrinsic or more pragmatic part of the expected free energy. In other words, the information gain afforded by the instructional conditions stimulus starts to decline, and at a particular threshold falls below the pragmatic or the extrinsic value, at which point the most likely behavior is to go straight to where the little mouse knows the reward is sitting. And that's exactly what we see at around trial 20 here, and the synthetic mouse goes straight to her reward on all occasions. So that's a basic illustration of the deterministic and systematic move from exploratory behavior to exploitative behavior, simply because there is this dual imperative to seek information and then seek reward, or to maintain certain goal states. But of course, as you become more familiar with an environment after exploring it, the novelty or the salience of that environment starts to decrease, and the more pragmatic imperatives start to emerge. What I'll do now is just show you how one can generalize this kind of formulation to reproduce quite sophisticated epistemic foraging of the kind that we might engage in. And I'm going to use reading as an example, or a very simplified form of reading, just to emphasize the interesting sequelae of formulating optimal behavior, where you're putting this sort of imperative to minimize uncertainty into the objective function, and how this uncertainty changes with time and with the things that you decide to do to produce a particular pattern and scheduling of the way that we go and gather information from the world. So in everything that follows, I'm now taking rewards away so that we can just reveal the epistemic nature of sentient behavior. And I'm going to start with exactly the same kind of Markov decision process as a generative model of outcomes. So this is a reproduction of an earlier slide with our Markov decision process here. What I'm going to do now is just make it slightly more interesting. I'm going to add a temporal depth. I'm going to now put a Markov decision process on top of my first Markov decision process. And crucially, the higher level Markov decision process is going to unfold more slowly in time. So this higher level process, from the point of view of a generative process or model, provides now a context that sets the initial states for a lower process that unfolds more quickly in time and then is reset for the next context and the next context. So from the point of view of the generative model, we're now, if you like, placing priors on the kinds of behaviors that would generate the most likely outcomes at the lower level. From the point of view of the equivalent normal style factor graph, we can conversely regard the lower level as supplying evidence for which context we are in. So this dual exchange is implicit in the belief updating, which is just a solution to the belief updating equations or the variational message passing that emerges under these deep Dichronic generative models. So the particular model that I want to use to illustrate the behaviors at hand is a model of reading, but a very simplified model where we're using sort of iconic letters as opposed to a script. So the lowest level of the model is sketched out here. And basically what this little agent can see is either a particular icon, a particular letter, depending upon where she looks at different quadrants in this word here. And these outcomes, the what and the where aspects of the sensed or observed outcomes, are generated by a number of hidden states. First of all, the hidden state, what word is she looking at? Is it the word flee, which is composed of these two letters? There's a little bird next to a cat. Or is it the word feed? There's a little bird next to some seed the bird could eat. Or is it the word wait? There's nothing next to the little bird. So this describes the context generating the particular outcomes at the first level. So we need to know what was the letter, flee, feed, or wait. We'd also need to know where she was looking, at this quadrant or that quadrant or this or that quadrant here. And just to make things interesting, I've also put a flip in here, which you can regard as a font change, just to make it more realistic, so that there's a degree of generalization. So given these states, I can always generate a particular set of outcomes under a particular set of moves, moving from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 or 3 to 4. And that is sufficient to write down a factor graph, which is sufficient to define the message passing and the self-evidencing. What about the second level? Right, well, clearly the sequence of words, the sentence that I can be generating is itself something that I have to specify from the point of view of the generative model. So I have to specify, well, what kinds of sentences could possibly be generated. And I've taken 3 sentences here. There's also a what, where aspect to the structure here. So it's what sentence is in play that is generating the words at the lower level or providing a contextual prior for the words at the lower level. And where am I in terms of the word and as part of a sequence as opposed to the letter as a part of the word. And I can write down these hidden states. That I can generate everything I need to know to tell me what the current word is and where I am looking in terms of wandering through the sentence. So I've got 2 levels of action. I can look at the next word, or I can look around this current word at various letters and accumulate information as I progress through the letters and the words, and thereby simulate reading. And this is basically what it looks like. So on the top is a description of, or a graphic illustrating the sequence of moves that this little agent made whilst reading this 4-word sentence: flee, wait, feed, wait here. The interesting thing about it is that she starts off looking around and accumulates evidence summarized here in terms of the expectations about what's happening at the lower level and what's happening at the higher level. So this is the second level expectations about what sentence she's reading, and these are the first level expectations about the particular word in play. The interesting thing about this simulation is that as soon as she's certain about the word, because if there's a cat on the upper row, then it has to be flee. She jumps to the next word, and after a couple of sufficient samples to reassure her or render her sufficiently certain that the next word is wait, that she then jumps to the next word. So what this is evincing is exactly the kind of sparse sampling that we actually use, not just in reading, but in terms of visually palpating the world, in fact, palpating the world with all different kinds of sense organs, just to get the information that we need in order to resolve our uncertainty about where to look next, to build confident, certain beliefs about states of affairs out there. And this is basically what we wanted to show with this simulation. I just wanted to conclude by coming back to the really interesting issues about the temporal scheduling of this kind of dichronic belief updating and foraging, in this instance foraging for information, but if we put rewards in, then it would be a mixture, a blend of foraging for rewards and goals and information. So what I've done here is to show the results of the simulated belief updating in a way that an electrophysiologist might measure them in a real brain. So at the top, we have the 6 sentences, and I just, if you like, color-coded the weight or the expectation that we are looking at the sentence 1 or sentence 4 here as time progresses during the planned reading of this sentence. Similarly, at the lower level, here are the 3 alternative words that could be seen at each, sorry, 3 alternative words that could be being looked at as the agent is foraging each of the letters in that word. And the final panel here are essentially just the smoothed versions of these rasters of, if this was simulated electrophysiology, neural activity, that can be read as local field potentials that we can measure empirically. And notice that the speed at which we accumulate information about the sentence is by construction of this dichronic deep generative model, much slower than the accumulation of evidence for the word flee, feed, or wait. So we see a very fast accumulation of evidence. So we're definitely looking at flee here as soon as we start, and then we quickly make up our mind about the subsequent words, and then move on to the next word, and slowly accumulate evidence for the different sentences. And there's an ambiguity here because we have to wait until the last word to disambiguate between sentences 1 and 4, and indeed when we get to the last word, this little agent can indeed confidently believe that she has been reading the sentence flee, wait, feed, and wait. I've shown the results like this because this is exactly the kind of neuronal dynamics that one sees empirically when looking at this kind of paradigm in monkey electrophysiology. So for example, here, these data, or this simulation, look very similar to the data acquired from unit electrode recordings, in this instance, pre-saccadic delay period activity in the prefrontal cortex, that is very reminiscent of the activity in this simulation. Similarly, recording fluctuations in electrochemical potentials that are one way of measuring the fluctuations in neural activity, show a remarkable similarity between the synthetic and real measurements of perisaccadic field potentials during active vision, in this instance in I think monkey, looking at higher and lower and higher areas of the visual brain. So I'm going to finish there because it provides a nice empirical endorsement that the brain may actually be using this sort of message passing in the service of sampling the world in the best way possible, in the sense of optimal Bayesian design, which has been understood and formalized for since the 1950s in terms of planning the best way to experiment to disclose those data that resolve the most uncertainty about your hypotheses. So this notion of Bayes optimality in terms of the principle of best experimental design is one way of reading the epistemic or the intrinsic motivation supplied by the expected free energy, and in that sense, you can regard perception and active sensing, active perception, in exactly the same way that people like Richard Gregory conceive of active sensing and perception as hypothesis testing, that really our behavior, our sentient behavior is in the game of getting the right kind of information that resolves our uncertainty about states of affairs beyond our sensory organs or outside of our skull. I'm going to give the final word to Einstein. Just remember that all of this rests upon this simple understanding and realization that the evidence for our models of the world can always be split into negative complexity or simplicity and accuracy, which just means not only in science, but also in our sentience, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And with that, all that remains is for me to thank all the people whose ideas I've been talking about, and to thank you for your attention. And I look forward to discussing these issues with you in the near future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. So now you have to imagine that everyone is clapping. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I would like to ask everyone who has questions to put those in the chat. And I take the opportunity to start with the first question. So you have this wonderful deep Dichronic model. Would that also be a possibility to easily model drift and changes in the environment? Say if you have, for example, seasonal changes, and people or persons are very good at adapting to that. So could you do that?
Yes, that's a very interesting question in relation to modeling the current epidemic, which is we've actually applied these models to the coronavirus outbreak, and that's a very pertinent question. Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you're saying there is that there is a separation of timescales at many levels. It just keeps on going. So what you would do in this particular example is just put another Markov decision process that was an order of magnitude slower on top of the two levels that we've already got, and this would provide a much slower context. So there will be leaf updating adaptation at a much slower time scale. Interesting aspect of your question, of course, is what we were looking at there is the fast belief updating, inferring latent or hidden states of the world. The same expected free energy and free energy maximizing, elbow maximizing dynamics when applied to the parameters of the model give you learning. So there's also inference and learning, and the two of those go hand in hand as well. So that's another interesting aspect. And then you can even take that further and say, can you put structure learning on top by using the time integral of the model evidence? So now you have a picture of structure learning. How many levels would you want that can be read as Bayesian model selection or natural selection if you're in biology?
Very interesting. So we have one question in the chat from Pranav Mahayan. I might summarize the first question. So these are actually two. First would be whether you could also model something like Pavlovian fear and risk aversion principles. So how can this reward seeking and information gain seeking also account for risk aversion schemes?
I think it to articulate risk aversion and risk sensitivity within this framework is relatively straightforward. So all you do is that you rewrite your cost function or your reward function as a log probability. So I was talking about sort of prior preferences. So you just take the logarithm of that, and then you have a continuous variable that goes from plus to minus infinity that scores the value or the extrinsic value of a particular outcome. Once you've done that, then you get all these sort of natural behaviors that one would see in reinforcement learning, with the added benefit that now you can measure your reward or your utility in natural units, because now you've expressed your utility as a log probability. So if you use natural logarithms, you've got natural units, which interestingly have the same units as information. So now you've got the value of information. You can either say, well, this bit of information is worth $3, or $3 is worth this amount of information. And the way that you balance the two is effectively by ascribing a precision, an inverse variance to those belief distributions. So once you've written down your reward in terms of probabilistic preferences, now you can make them quantitatively bigger or smaller by making them more or less precise. So if I'm very, very confident, have very precise beliefs, I like these things and I don't like those, that will dominate the pragmatic or the expected utility part of the expected free energy, and that will suppress possibly the risk aspect. Whereas if I have very, very imprecise, I don't have any confident beliefs about what I find rewarding, my subjective utility, if you like, then it's likely that I might become more sensitized to the the ambiguity term, and I might become more careful and want to resolve ambiguity and be less sensitive to the or act as if I was less worried about the risks because I'm less confident about what I find rewarding. So a really interesting question. In principle, you should be able to fit the precisions in order to make them match exactly with economic forms of risk aversion and the like.
There's another question in the chat. So that would be the question about your views on including or how including emotional balance into the framework. And the suggestion would be whether first and second derivative of free energy would fit that, or what would be your view on that?
Well, that's a challenging question, and certainly people have proposed for many years now that the sort of the rate of change of free energy as a score in terms of how well you are engaging with your world is a nice valenced measure of that could predict your emotional status. I think that's a useful heuristic. However, I think that the more direct answer to this is it's all in the uncertainty. If you estimate and you predict that you are now in a context, an environment, in a situation where your uncertainty about what to do is irreducible, that's going to make you feel anxious and bad. So the good feelings, the aha moments, the realization, oh yes, I've won that lottery, or it's dinner time, or it's my favorite sitcom. All of these things, when you feel good and happy, all come along with this collapse of uncertainty, and the way forward becomes very, very clear. So in a sense, that is, if you like, an anticipation of an improvement in the free energy, but that has to be represented in the generative model. It has to be part of your belief structure and your belief system and your representation of the world. And it looks as if that is the closest thing in the generative model to that kind of monitoring the fluctuations in how well I'm doing in terms of the free energy, seems to be the precision of beliefs about what I'm doing, which is, of course, the dopamine, what we think might be the thing that dopamine registers. So at a very simple level of just valence, things being good and bad, I would ascribe that to the precision of beliefs about what I'm going to do. So when things get better, that basically means is I can see the way ahead clearly.
Thank you. So I'm looking a bit at the time. So I expect, although there would be more questions, we have to stop here because the time is more or less over, and we expect the next speaker to be here in like 2 minutes. So thanks from everyone attending the session for this excellent talk and discussion. And we hope to be able to see everyone, and you also in particular, in the near future in person. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
And bye-bye.